Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hey everyone, good afternoon. I'm Susan Kaufman. I'm here for Attitude's weekly ADHD Experts broadcast. Today we'll be talking with Carla Counts Allan, Ph.D., about behavioral parent training, which is a well-established first-line treatment plan for children. It's one that's recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics for preschoolers before medication with ADHD and alongside stimulant medication for older children. Dr. Allan will describe what behavioral parent training is, how it works, and what kinds of changes parents can expect in their children's behavior if and when it's effective. I'd like to introduce our speaker to you today. We're very pleased to have her here. She is Carla Counts Allan, PhD, a psychologist, and the director of ADHD programs at Children's Mercy in Kansas City, where she oversees programs designed to improve the lives of children. She's involved in graduate medical education. She's an active researcher. Dr. Allan's a frequent presenter on treatment interventions for children with ADHD, on disruptive behavior, and on anxiety. She serves on the ADHD Clinical Practice Guidelines Subcommittee for the American Academy of Pediatrics, and you can reach Dr. Allan at childrensmercy.org/profiles/Carla C. Allan. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Allan. We're so grateful for your time. And I would also like to thank the sponsor of this week's webinar. We are always grateful to our sponsors, and this one is Omega Bright. Omega Bright 70-10MD is a proprietary high-concentrate omega-3 formulation. It was developed by Dr. Carol Locke while at the Harvard Medical School. It's clinically demonstrated to reduce anxiety by 20% in healthy medical students in an NIH-funded, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial, and also to reduce inflammatory cytokines, IL-6, by 14%. So, Omega Bright fish oils are available exclusively at omegabright.com. And thank you, Omega Bright. So, just a few quick comments to our listeners about how our webinars work. Dr. Allan will speak for about a half an hour, and then we'll take your questions, as many as we have time for. When you'll enter your questions in the Ask a Question sentence section of the screen. If you'd like to download the slides now, you can do so by clicking on Download the Webinar Slides in the Event Resources section of the screen. Some people like to print them out. When the webinar ends, and this is important, a post-event survey will pop up. It will ask you to rate the usefulness of the webinar first, and then it will be followed by 3 questions called required for certificate of attendance. If you're not interested in a certificate of attendance, just move on and go about your day. If you'd like a certificate of attendance emailed to you, then you should answer those 3 questions and hit submit. So thank you so much, everyone. Don't forget that audio issues are probably usually caused by a slow internet connection, and you should be on a wired connection with your browser tabs all closed if possible. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Allan with our thanks again for being here.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for the introduction, Susan, and the opportunity to spend time with each of you guys today, talking about some of my favorite topics, which are kids with ADHD and behavioral interventions. As Susan mentioned, we'll spend about 30 to 35 minutes together today, reviewing the background about what behavioral parent training is, and then the rest of the time will be spent for question and answer. And I hope that you'll find this to be a good use of your time and informative. I'm really grateful that you're taking the time to spend it with me today. So today, here are the things that you can expect to learn from the presentation. I expect that you'll be able to describe how behavioral training works and what changes you can expect to see in your kid. I expect that you'll be able to identify methods for measuring progress and deciding when it's time to make changes to your treatment plan. And then I will hope that you'll be able to describe the types of behavioral parent training programs that exist. And so with that, let's move on. All right, so the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is what causes ADHD. And I want to do this because I want you all to understand why parenting is so central to treatment, no matter what treatment it is that you choose. So first and foremost, what causes it is one, genes. So we know that ADHD is one of the most sort of genetically inheritable disorders relative to other mental health conditions. So genetics play a big role, as do some non-genetic causes. And those include things like, traumatic brain injuries or times when kids have, not had full oxygen to their brains, or things sometimes that can happen in the labor and delivery process. And so those things can cause ADHD too. And it's important to know that no matter what research has happened over the last 100, 200 years, we know now that ADHD is not caused by social factors alone. There is nothing that you guys are doing as parents that are causing ADHD in your child. It's definitely not your fault that your kid has ADHD. I hope you hear that loud and clear today. But you are also the only person, or really the best person, in the driver's seat to be able to help fix the things that are challenging for your child. And why is that? It's because everything that you would do that's evidence-based to help your kid, all of it really relies on you. So, for example, even as something as simple as starting medication, parents who have done that can speak very clearly to the fact that it's up to you to remember when it's time to get the prescription refilled. It's up to you oftentimes to help your child remember to take it in the morning. No matter what it is, it's all going to require effort from you. And so I just want to highlight that, to me, you all are super parents. I mean, parenting is difficult no matter what kind of kid you're parenting. It's even more challenging when you've got a kiddo with ADHD. And so, again, I'm really grateful that you're spending time here with me to learn more about how to do it a little differently. Okay, so it's important to know also kind of how long ADHD lasts and how this impacts the course of treatment over time. So ADHD is considered a chronic condition, and you can kind of think a little bit of it like diabetes might be, right? If you've got type 1 diabetes, you're going to need to manage your blood sugar through the use of insulin probably throughout most of your life, actually throughout most of your life. ADHD is considered the same thing. While it may be true that some kids might outgrow it over time, that seems to be, most of us through research know that that's a minority these days. And the ones who do outgrow it typically are kids who have milder conditions of ADHD to begin with, and who still suffer some kind of lasting impairment, although maybe not at the clinical level anymore. And so the point is that early skill development and intervention is really important. And even with that, there are going to be bumps in the road developmentally that require you to return to treatment just to kind of re-up the things that you're doing and learning about. And so I want you to know that the treatment should be considered a process that might need to be reestablished for periods of time throughout the lifespan. In terms of theories of ADHD, I bring this up too because it's really understanding what science says causes ADHD is important, because those things should link to treatment. I say this because there are lots of people out there with lots of kinds of treatment that haven't been shown to be fully effective yet. And some that's even worse than that, I would say in some ways kind of preys on parents and families that are sort of desperate. And oftentimes they'll talk to you about their treatment cures ADHD because it targets XYZ, and XYZ are things sometimes that are known to not be related to ADHD at all in the medical literature. And so for me, I know that there's a lot of money and time spent in these treatments, and I want you to be able to understand what differentiates those that have been shown to be effective in research and those that are not. So when we look at what causes ADHD, broadly speaking now, we're looking at things called executive functioning deficits. And I'll kind of go through some of those one by one, but even more broadly than that, we know that ADHD is a deficit really in self-regulation. And so behavioral parent training works by helping your kids develop skills in self-regulation. And so when we look at the deficits that are commonly associated with ADHD, what we see is that working memory, which is your ability to take something and hold it in memory and then do something with that information later in a way that's appropriate. That's a clear deficit in kids with ADHD, as is response inhibition, which is just a very fancy way of saying When there's something that you want to do, but you know it's not the right thing to do, being able to hold that impulse and not engage in that activity at that time. That is something that's really challenging for kids with ADHD. If they think it, they do it a lot of the time. And so that is a deficit we've seen through lots of research on ADHD too. Delay aversion is another one. And it's fancy speak for really saying that waiting is very painful for these children. It's very painful because it's something that they're not as strongly suited to do. In some research studies, if children with ADHD are offered a very small reward for doing a task that's effortful now, or a bigger reward for hanging in there and doing that thing that's a little harder for a little longer, they'll almost always choose the small reward now. And that's because waiting and planning and continuing to do things that are effortful are very difficult for kids with ADHD in general. We also know through research studies that ADHD kids can sometimes have a poor response to rewards, but also to punishment. And this is key. This is why some of the tried and true sort of parenting strategies, the things that are out there that are just kind of common sense that people know how to do, sometimes aren't as effective as we'd like for them to be. It's because of some of these deficits in self-regulation that we know are part and parcel or causal really in ADHD. We also know that slow cognitive processing can be an issue in kids with ADHD. And, in a nutshell, what that means is that when information is given to them, it can take them a little longer to process and understand what it is that they are to do with that information. And I'm sure that's something that you have seen in your everyday lives with your kids with ADHD. And so I bring these things up because effective treatment really should target these problems, and behavioral parent training definitely does. Okay, so when we look at an overview of what treatments really work for kids with ADHD, and in here I'm really talking about behavioral treatments, so to speak. Medication, especially stimulant medication, is definitely something that's been shown to be effective too, but I'm not highlighting that as much. I'm mostly covering behavioral interventions today. So well-established treatments, which are not easy to get, by the way, that classification of well-established treatment, it means that it's had to been shown through all kinds of research studies by different kinds of study teams with different kinds of populations. It has to be a demonstrated track record of sustained improvement. And so behavioral parent training definitely has that. And as I've mentioned before, it's the most important aspect of treatment. Why is that? Parenting is something that mediates negative outcomes. That's a very fancy way of saying that the things that all of us as parents are worried about for our kids with ADHD, things like, are they going to be able to make it through school successfully? Are they going to get in trouble with the law? Are they, going to get hurt by some of the dangerous or risky behaviors that they do? Parenting helps to mediate some of those negative outcomes, meaning when parenting is a good fit for kids with ADHD, they are much less likely to have those severe sort of negative longer-term outcomes. So that goodness of fit between parents' sort of style and approach and the needs of an ADHD kid is, again, central. It's everything to really helping us keep them on the right track. And what we know about parenting, especially for kids with ADHD, that's so important is we want to increase positive reinforcement and decrease what we kind of call harsh or inconsistent parenting. And even though there seems to be kind of a negative label when I say harsh or inconsistent parenting, I also want to be really upfront and say, when you're parenting kids with ADHD, it is harder. Okay, we know through research that these kids are more stressful to parent. They cause more stress between parents in a marriage because people will argue over whether it's the right approach or not. I understand that harsh and inconsistent parenting is kind of everybody's default if they don't have some of the training and support to learn how to do it a little differently, just by the nature of how difficult it can be to parent these kids. So again, I want to highlight here, there's nothing wrong with you. You're a great parent. It's just that some of those common sense approaches need to be tinkered with a little bit when we've got a kid with ADHD, and that's what people like me are happy to help you do. So So other well-established treatments for kids with ADHD include things like behavioral classroom management. This is stuff like helping teachers learn how to better praise and use positive interventions for kids when they're doing the right thing, and to ignore or use some mild forms of punishment too when needed for kids who are not. There are also things like behavioral peer-based interventions. I want to be clear here that there's a distinction, or we should make a distinction between behavioral peer-based interventions where they're kind of clinic-based. So we know that it's not the location necessarily that matters about whether or not the treatment works. So going to like a clinic where you're with your kid and a group of other kids with ADHD and they're learning how to have good social skills there, that might help them have good social skills in that setting. But chances are good that without a link, some sort of intervention that follows them to the place where they need to be doing those skills, like having a teacher that understands what those skills were that were taught in the group, and a way of measuring it and giving your kids performance-based feedback about it. If that's not there, it's not likely to be as effective as it should be. And so I hope that makes sense, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that later if you have any. Organization training actually is now an evidence-based intervention for adolescents, especially with ADHD. The goal with organization training is all about improving organization and time management and decreasing those academic impairments that kids can have with ADHD in adolescents especially. And then there are other kinds of treatments like combined behavioral management programs that might include something like the summer treatment program for ADHD that takes some of these different elements of the ones I've talked about before and puts them all together in a program. And so those are the other well-established behavioral or psychosocial treatments really for ADHD. All right, so linking back to those causes that we've talked about before with executive functioning, I want to kind of highlight here from a theoretical perspective why these things work so well for ADHD, okay? And so when you've got kids with working memory deficits, again, the ability to take information, hold it in your brain, and do something with it at the time that you need to, we know that's a weakness, and one of the ways that behavioral parent training will help your child overcome that weakness is by teaching you how to use checklists or even visual schedules to help establish new skills within routines. It's a really important thing for kids to understand what's coming next or what's expected, and the goal with this is to create some structure here that allows your child to take ownership of it, so that it's not just you having to nag and reinforce and nag and reinforce. If we can create the visual schedule for them or use checklists for kids who are a little older, we're giving them the tools that they need, and then we can sit back and just reinforce as we need to. And so behavioral parent training, all of them, no matter which one you use, will help you with that. And just for everybody to understand, visual schedules include, if you've got like a much younger kid, you might have a little list in the bathroom with the first thing is we brush our teeth. So a picture of the toothbrush. The second one is a comb for your hair. And then the third one is like little pictures of clothes. So they understand the next thing to do is to get dressed. That's what visual schedules really are. Another way that behavioral parent training folks work on improving working memory is by teaching parents how to use more effective commands. And this is one of those things I think that sounds so silly at the outset. I mean, when you tell a kid to do something, it should be pretty clear what it is that you want. However, if we really stop and think about it in ourselves and we observe ourselves, you will find, I'm fairly certain, that sometimes you give commands that maybe have multiple steps involved in them. And so if you're a kid with ADHD and you're trying really hard that day and you're listening when mom asks you to pick up your shoes, go up to your room and get dressed. If you're a kid with working memory issues, you might be able to get through the first two, but if you fail on the third, even though you're 2/3 of the way successful, you're going to get some negative feedback, right? I mean, eventually you guys are going to have to leave in the morning to get to school. And so, what will happen? Parents will come up to the room and find them doing something else instead of the third step. And so then you'll have to use some reprimands. And that, on the whole, does not help kids or doesn't motivate them necessarily to do things a little differently next time. And so, effective commands are stated simply. You can use the word please, but But oftentimes for kids with ADHD, at least initially, they're one-step commands. They're very specific. Please pick up your shoes. They go and pick up their shoes, and then you say, please put your shoes in your cubby or in your closet. That level of specificity is required so that they can start to understand cause and effect. When I listen and I follow through, my parents are happy with me. When we kind of couple a bunch of them all together, it just makes it a lot harder for them to be successful. And it gives you fewer opportunities to praise, which is so important. As a quick aside, I'll say, if you were to count how many times a day kids with ADHD are reprimanded by adults in their lives. Reprimanded meaning, kind of chastised, or they receive negative feedback about something they've done. It's pretty clear pretty quickly that these can add up, reprimands, into the millions by the time they're in their adolescent years. And so one clear thing we know through behavioral training, no matter what it's for, is that when there are things we want kids to continue doing, we have to pay attention to them. And so if kids are getting a lot of attention, instead, negative attention for the things they're not doing, it's going to increase the frequency, the rate of those behaviors we don't want to see, which is why we got to kind of flip it around on its head a little bit. And so for response inhibition, which again, to define first, response inhibition is being able to keep yourself from doing something you want to do, even though you know it's not the right time or it's not appropriate. With response inhibition, what we want to do is use reinforced practice of pro-social behavior. It's a very long way of saying, and let me maybe give an example here. If you've got a kiddo who every time he's trying to share a toy with his sister gets really frustrated with her and ends up hitting her in the shoulder, what you'd want to do is be able to teach him how to do something better or different to replace that hitting behavior, and then you're going to want to reinforce it. And so if we're talking about maybe a kid who's 4 and again hits his sister every time she takes a toy, you're going to want to teach him to use his words instead, which is, will you please share that with me? Or coming to find you and asking you for help. Either one of those, I think we can all agree, is better than hitting his sister. And what reinforced practice means is that you're going to have him practice this in various parts of the house with various toys, and you're going to use little rewards to reinforce that. And so for a little kid, it might be you get a Skittle every time you're just willing to show me that you can use the words, will you share it with me? Or, Mom, I need your help, instead of hitting her. When you do that, now you've gotten in some repetition, some reps, just like you would if you're trying to learn how to lift weights, right? Or anything else that we would expect, hit the baseball. Getting the reps in is so important for it to become a skill that can then be automatic, something that's just done correctly without us having to think too much about it. So reinforced practice is especially important when the thing that you want your kid to do is something they haven't yet done before, or a skill they don't yet have. That's the place to start. And then you're going to look to find ways to increase praise or catch them doing good. And so in this example, if you know, for example, that things tend to fall apart with your 4-year-old who hits the sister, usually after they've been playing together for 5 minutes, you're going to make sure that you're going to let them play for 3 minutes and then come in and praise right at that moment before things go south. Hey, I love how nicely you guys are sharing things. That's great. You want to catch them doing good instead, so that that behavior, the one that you want, increases. So I hope that's clear too. With behavioral parent training and delay aversion, one of the things that we know is that just by changing the reward schedule and increasing the frequency, we can increase the effectiveness of rewards. So for example, let's say you've got a 10-year-old kid and you have said to them, well, if you get, mostly A's on your report card, maybe you can have 1 or 2 B's, that is how you're going to earn your bike. That sort of intervention at times can be very difficult for kids with ADHD because we're talking about a long period of time, depending on how long the quarter is or semester at your school. It would be better to think about how to break up those steps involved in getting good grades, and to measure that more frequently and have that be the way that kids earn rewards. So for example, if you want to improve their homework time and the completion of their homework. You could focus on that every night instead. For every assignment that you complete within this period of time, you earn television time tonight. You earn the ability to pick an activity for me and you to do after your homework is over. By increasing the frequency of when you deliver these rewards, you are now increasing the power of your kid's ability to be able to do it. Again, think back to that research study that I talked about earlier, where kids with ADHD will almost always choose a much smaller reward for much smaller effort now than bigger effort over a longer period of time and a bigger reward. So we want to use that to our advantage and provide some more frequent feedback, daily feedback, really, about how they're performing. And so with that said, you can help with delay aversion or that difficulty with waiting by using timers. You can chunk work into smaller bits. If the whole homework routine, which lasts an hour, is too painful for them, for every 10 minutes of active work, they can take a short break or earn a small piece of a reward for later. And so all of those are built into most behavioral parent training programs. And then last but not least, you can use a combination of short-term and long-term rewards. And by this, I mean, short-term rewards would be daily ones where they're earning screen time based on how they're doing with whatever routine you're targeting, homework routine or morning routine. But then for consistency over the days, they can earn longer term rewards like weekly ones that are delivered on the weekend. So that might be if 4 out of the 5 days you met most of your morning routine goals, you now on the weekend have access to XYZ and something that they like. So in terms of that, addressing the poor response to reward, we always want to make sure that when we're setting up these behavioral programs that the goals are fair. And to do this, we're going to use baseline data to set the goals and adjust as needed. By this, I mean, if we're going to work on the frequency of disrespectful language towards you, the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to take little tally marks of how many times disrespectful language is happening to you without us even doing any intervention of it first. I need to understand the natural frequency of this so that the goals that we're setting are fair. They're within reach. Why is this important? Because kids with ADHD can smell something fake coming from a far away. And so if we tell them, we're now going to have you earn rewards for doing this. And that means to be able to earn this, you can't be disrespectful at all today. They're going to look at you and say, no, thank you. I don't want to participate in this behavioral reward plan. We want them to be motivated right away. And that means they have to believe that it's within reach, the reward. You want to make sure that the rewards matter. Don't guess about what you think that they like. Ask and observe. So if you were to say to them, your whole Saturday, this Saturday is completely free. You can choose whatever activities that you want to do. If you were to ask them that, what would they choose to do? Keep some notes on that, and that gives you a sense of the things that they might be willing to work for in a behavioral reward plan. You want to vary rewards. You want to use a reward store. By this, I mean, I'll kind of give an example for myself. I am someone who really likes shoes. Anyone who knows me knows that shoes are kind of my thing. However, no matter how much I love my job, if Children's Mercy tomorrow were to tell me that your paycheck can now only be spent at the shoe store down the street, I would first maybe be really happy about it, right? I could buy all of the shoes that I wanted, but pretty quickly I'd be bored with the shoes that I have, and I would be less likely to show up to work. The same thing happens with kids in behavioral reward plans at home. We need to switch them up ever so often, replace ones that are boring with some new ones. We want to use a reward store where I could buy shoes, certainly if I wanted to, in my own example, but my hospital could also allow me to go and buy food that I like and other things, real world stuff where you have some choice in it. It's important to make our economy in behavioral parent training look like the economy that kids really want to use, where they have some choice and flexibility in it. As I said before, short-term rewards teach the skills. And by that, I mean daily ones, right? So if we're working on the homework routine, I want kids to be able to earn rewards on Monday as soon as they've completed the homework routine in the way that we've asked them to. But I might also want for them to earn on Saturday rewards that are bigger, that reflect how well they've done throughout the week, to teach consistency in the utilization of those skills on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I hope that makes sense. All right. In terms of poor response to punishment, no matter what behavioral parent training you use, they're all going to help you build the relationship first. This is key because no matter what kind of excellent parent you are, kids are going to want to work even harder for you if we can find ways to decrease the reprimands and increase those positive feelings. Certainly you all can think back on your own experiences in work and think about which bosses did I love working for and which ones not so much. And oftentimes the ones you loved working for, they were inspiring. They gave you a little bit of freedom or some choice over what your day looked like, maybe. Certainly they provided a lot of reward for the choices that you made that were great, and they didn't harp too much on when mistakes were made. We want to take that same sort of relationship between boss and employee and what makes a good relationship and instill that in the way that we work with parents and children too. So again, praise and rewards are going to be prioritized over punishment. All of these programs will teach you how to use planned ignoring. That's a fancy way of saying you are going to choose just a few behaviors, not the most severe ones, that you actually just completely ignore when they're done. It's a very effective way of getting kids to stop doing that behavior. And so all of the programs use that to some degree. They're going to teach you how to use reinforced practice, and they're going to teach you how to use punishment sparingly. That's important because, again, too much punishment makes it so that kids don't want to work for you. They don't want to replace those negative behaviors with the new ones that we need to see them do. And so in terms of punishment, most behavioral parent training programs will focus on timeout or job grounding as ways to do that. Timeout is what it sounds like. It's time out from positive reinforcement. Depending on the age of your kid, that can be pretty brief as it takes for them to calm themselves down and get out. Or it could be a little bit longer based on their age. There's not as much evidence-based or science to the length of timeout, by the way, as people think that there ought to be. I always advocate for very brief timeouts. Why? Because the goal with all of these things is to help kids understand cause and effect. If I do this, this is what's coming. That is more likely for kids to understand when you can do timeout every time the bad behavior happens. When there's a really long timeout, there's nothing else for you to do, really, except for to hold that timeout. And so while kids are in timeout, they can continue to, be verbally disrespectful to you, and there's nothing more that you can really do about it. And so I hope that's clear, but what I'm really saying here is brief is better because there's a greater one-to-one correspondence there between what has happened and what the consequence is, which is key to helping your kids understand cause and effect. Job grounding is another method of that, which is effective and used for older kids. Job grounding essentially is a way of having kids be grounded from the things that they like to do until they complete a chore, and the chore should be brief. So no matter what punishment you're using, though, it needs to really meet these 4 criteria, which is fair. It's got to fit the crime. It needs to be mild. It needs to be delivered as immediately as possible to when that behavior that you didn't like occurred. And it needs to be consistent so that whenever you see it, the punishment happens, but also whenever dad sees it or grandmother or whoever else is involved in that child's life, or whenever you see it on a Monday, the same way as when you see it on a Tuesday. That consistency is really important. So moving along with slow processing speed, behavioral parent training really helps you understand the importance of not rapid fire reissuing commands, because all kids take a little bit of time to process the language. In fact, even kids who are really compliant might take as long as 10 seconds, especially if they're busy at the time that you asked, to kind of process what you've asked them to do and to start to make a reasonable and appropriate effort to comply. And so I would encourage you, and behavioral parent training people they'll encourage you to start to count to yourself after you've given a command to 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3, until you get to 10 Mississippi before you even think about reissuing the command. I'd encourage you to check it out for yourself and see how long 10 Mississippi feels to you. It feels incredibly long for me. It's very awkward when you think about it that way, but it's so important. Again, it'll teach you how to use effective commands. It will also teach you that you want to ensure good eye contact and be really close to kids before you issue the command so that they know you're serious about it and that there's nothing distracting them in between you and the command. And then if need be, you can assess for understanding, especially when you're close. So when should we be using behavioral parent training? Well, as often as possible, certainly. And some researchers go so far to say, and it's based in good research, that you should preferably start behavioral parent training even before medication. And I will tell you that clinically speaking, though, this is my exception, a clinical exception. It's not necessarily based on research. I do think the exception here, though, is based on when you've got kids with major safety concerns. And so I think about that in kinds of two periods of development. When you've got little kids, potentially with ADHD, who are very impulsive and are leaving your house without your permission or climbing on things or doing dangerous stuff that they've gotten injured, I think medicine is a pretty reasonable place to start. In those kids, and that behavioral parent training can start soon after. I would also say that for adolescents who are driving, there is some data to suggest in those cases that medication can really be helpful in minimizing accidents that could be a problem out on the road. And so I think those are two exceptions. The reason medication should be used after behavioral parent training, according to that study, the Pelham et al. Study in 2016, was that parents were less likely to attend behavioral parent training and less likely to do their homework and complete the sort of assignments when their kids have started medicine. And so, I kind of want to make this distinction between medicine helps with symptom control, but it doesn't necessarily help with impairment or teaching new skill development. And that's where behavioral parent training comes in. And that's why those two of them together are so lovely. You could also think about starting behavioral parent training under other circumstances, like when the diagnosis isn't purely well established, when there are other disruptive behavior disorders that come along with it, when the response to medication is incomplete, or certainly for younger kids too. All behavioral parent training, though, should take a very data-driven approach. These slides are really just meant to show you the level of specificity that we should be aiming for here when we're looking at measuring baseline behaviors that are a problem for kids. So you can see there's a definition, for example, of complaining and whining that makes it really clear so that you, me, the neighbor next door, all of us know when an instance of complaining and whining has happened and we can tally it correctly. All behavioral approaches take that data-driven approach that also helps us monitor progress over time. And so that's how you would know, too, if something needs to be changed. And so this also here on this slide is an example of a daily report card in the home setting, which is a very evidence-based intervention. What you can see here is it clearly defines the behaviors that are expected for a particular child, and it also highlights what their rewards might be for meeting the different goals. And I want you to pay attention to the fact that it's not an all or nothing, right? It's not you either meet all 4 goals and you get your TV time or you get nothing. Every step in the right direction deserves some kind of recognition. And so all of that is highlighted in that data-driven approach. What changes should you expect to see? You should see small incremental decreases in problem behavior. Behavioral parent training generally doesn't result in automatic large decreases in problem behavior. It takes time and practice on your part to deliver it so that your kids can learn from it and adjust their behavior accordingly. And so you'll see gradual increases in positive behavior. Certainly you will see slow but steady improvements in your relationship with your child, and you will start to feel more in control and at peace with your parenting, which I think is priceless. How will you know it's working? As I kind of highlighted before in those data-driven sort of charts, you'll know through the frequency or duration of problem behaviors whether they're slowly decreasing, because your behavioral parent training therapist should be able to help you measure that over time. Some will use rating scales that measure impairment over time that help you evaluate progress, and they'll share the results with you. You should be able to see over time, are we getting there or not? And most importantly, I want you to know that side effects do happen. They're real in behavioral parent training too. We talk about them all the time with medicine, like sleepiness or irritability. There are side effects that can happen in behavioral parent training too. In a nutshell, when we teach people how to do planned ignoring, if we haven't been careful about that, one of the things that can happen is that any kid who is now being ignored for something that they used to get attention for, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to increase the frequency or intensity of that problem behavior for a while, hoping that they'll get that familiar response from you again, where you're giving them attention or it's getting them out of something they don't want to do. If we start to provide attention right when that behavior has gotten a lot worse because we've been ignoring it, we have now reinforced a new level of that problem behavior that might even last. And so those are things to pay attention to. If you're seeing those things, you should talk to your therapist about it. Don't just quit. It's really important, and there are things we can absolutely do to address that. What programs work for ADHD? These are all effective behavioral parent training programs. All of them are fantastic with great research evidence behind them, and all are available in different parts of the country for sure. One of the things that I want to highlight here is that some might be a little bit more effective for one age versus the other. And so when you're asking yourself, which one is best for me? The simplest answer is the best here, and it's the one that's available and the one that you can do. And so some of these require more time than others. So for example, parent-child interaction therapy is fabulous, but it will probably take at least 16 sessions to get through it. And you may not realistically or feasibly have the ability to come back over 16 weeks. That's cool. Admit it, and then pick a program that is more closely aligned with your goals. So all of these programs on the previous slide share similar components but differ by the number of sessions or pace, whether it's a group format or individual. And then some target specific age groups. Like I mentioned, that parent-child interaction therapy is typically for children 7 and under. All right, just a few more, so hang in here with me and then we'll get started on our Q&A. In terms of how to assess quality, behavioral therapy is high quality when it's structured, but it's flexible to meet your needs. When it's all about skills practice and performance feedback for your child, meaning it helps you figure out how to give them some feedback about how they're doing and practice those new skills. And the feedback needs to be pretty regular. All behavioral parent training programs will give you homework, because there's nothing magical about coming to a therapist's office for 1 hour a week. The real work happens outside in your homes or in their schools. Again, data-driven is so important, and parents should be the primary target of intervention. If you're seeing someone who says they're a behavioral therapist, but they're spending almost all of their time exclusively with your child to treat their ADHD, and they can't tell you what they're doing in there or what the homework is, that should be a sign of concern to you that you may not be getting what you should. And then when should you consider changes like adding medicine if the rating scales don't show the improvement after you've had several appointments and you've been completing your homework? If you're not seeing changes, then that might be a time to make the change in adding medicine. If behavioral therapy has side effects that you just can't tolerate anymore, that would be a time to maybe think about adding medicine. And again, I want to just urge you to be careful of stopping during the middle of extinction burst, which is that fancy way of saying when the behavior is at its worst. And then you may also consider adding medicine when your child is having serious academic impairments or serious dangerous behaviors, as I mentioned before. So that concludes my review of the background of behavioral parent training. And again, I hope that you found it to be informative, and I'm going to give it back to Susan so that we can get started on the Q&A.
Thank you so much. It sounds incredibly powerful. I wanted to just back up all the way and ask you to describe how someone would actually undergo parent training. I understand that there are different programs, but are they? How do they work? Does the child go as well as the parent? Are they location based, or does someone come into the home? If I'm a parent and I want to start out with seeking out parent behavior training, where do I start and what are my options?
Yeah, I love this question because I think it can be really confusing and difficult to find the right place and to know what to expect. And so the first thing I would encourage you to do is to talk to your pediatrician about this, because the American Academy of Pediatrics has been for a while really pushing pediatricians to build part of their practice, including referral resources. So they ought to have a reasonable understanding of who's out there in their community delivering these kinds of services. So I think that's always an excellent place to start the discussion. Alternatively, if you've got insurance, you can call your insurance company and ask them, or sometimes they're even available online, who the different people are in your community that are therapists that are providing these services. That's another way to get a hold of that. Once you have called and made a decision to start with someone, I'd encourage you to interview them about their behavioral. Do they use the word behavioral parent training in their discussion with you at the outset on the phone or on their website? If they don't, I would steer clear. This is very different than play therapy. It's, different than all those other kinds of things. When you do behavioral parent training, you ought to expect as a parent to spend at least half of the time, at least, with the therapist in the room with your child. And, what it specifically looks like in terms of the breakdown on time with which person, the kid or the parent, depends on the age of the child. So, for example, when I'm first starting out with really little kids, like preschoolers, I might spend the vast majority of the time with everybody all together in the room. I might spend a little time at the beginning and the end with just parents on my own to kind of help them understand and lay the groundwork of what we're doing. But the bulk of the work will be done together, where I'm demonstrating the exact techniques that I want them to be able to use at home. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, very much so. And people, one of the questions is there a central registry or a website where one might find parent behavior training options?
Yeah, so I would encourage you to go to effectivechildtherapy.org.
Okay.
They have a list of some referral resources that I think is really top-notch. They help you understand a little bit more about what questions to ask. There are resources like for psychologists, for example, you can search who is board certified. That's a mark of quality. It's a mark that the therapist is using, the psychologist is using evidence-based interventions. I think that's abpp.org, which stands for the American Board of Professional Psychology. That's another way to make sure you're getting someone in your area. I think that a lot of times teaching hospitals and universities do a great job of providing these services. So if you have some of those in your community, that's also an excellent place to start.
Okay.
And again, your pediatrician ought to know a fair amount.
Would you mind just repeating the name of that website again? It sounded like a great resource.
Effectivechildtherapy.org.
Effectivechildtherapy.org. Okay, and similarly, people are just looking for the background resources here. Are there any books that you recommend as being especially helpful?
Oh gosh, I have a lot of books I love. So I think that Russell Barkley does a fantastic job. He's written a couple of books about parenting children with ADHD. He is always my go-to resource. And so I love that work. I think for any parents who are interested in other aspects of parenting kids with ADHD, like the importance of sleep, which we didn't talk about today, but it's huge, or diet in ADHD. Joel Nigg has an excellent book too called Getting Ahead of ADHD, and that author's name is Nigg, N-I-G-G. I love that book as well. And then the American Academy of Pediatrics has a parenting book for ADHD, about ADHD, that has been out. And then I think the new one is coming out sometime by the end of this year. So I would keep my eyes out on any of those resources too.
Okay. Joel Nigg has done several webinars, by the way, for Attitude, and you can find him on our website. He is great. I would concur with that.
Yeah, he was my first mentor. So
really, he's terrific. Yeah. He's really terrific. Yeah.
Agreed.
Let's see. I guess we could jump into some of the specific problems that some of the listeners are having. I'll just jump right into one, which 5 or 6 people mentioned, which is lying.
Okay.
This seems to be parents of kids in the 5 to 7-year-old range who feel that, they're really at a loss as to how to deal with. No, but there's also someone asking about teens and lying. So in general, I guess let's just talk about dealing with lying.
Great. Well, I'm going to try to answer this in 2 parts. The first part, I'm going to speak exclusively about those kids in the 5 to 7-year-old range. So when you're talking about kids who are in the 5 to 7-year-old range, I do just want to point out developmentally, this is pretty normal. And lying developmentally is actually kind of a good sign because, for example, kids who have autism and trouble taking perspective, they aren't necessarily great liars, right? They're not great liars because they don't understand that they might have thoughts that are private to them that are different from another individual. And so all I'm trying to say by that example is that it's not a bad thing. It's a mark of progress developmentally that your kid is able to lie. Now, do we have to tolerate that? Absolutely not. And so regardless of age now, I'm speaking about the general approach for dealing with lying, whether it's an adolescent or a kid who's 5 to 7, is to, first of all, reduce the opportunities to lie. By that, I mean, as parents, we're not going to ask them questions that give them the wiggle room. If we already know the answer about what has happened, we're just not even going to ask. We're going to deliver the consequence. So, for example, if I know that they've taken something of mine without my permission, I'm not going to say, did you take my makeup? I'm going to say, my makeup is missing and therefore you have a job grounding card. So the first thing is we're not going to put them in the position to lie. Any kid who is reasonably smart is going to try to lie in that situation, hoping that they're going to get away with it. And we don't want to fault them for that. So that's the first thing. The second is you are now going to have some discussion around, telling the truth and why it's so important. But we're not just going to have discussion around it. We're going to positively reinforce them for it. So you might create like a behavioral system where, hey, every time I ask you something and you've told me the truth, and I know that before it would have been hard for you to do, you're going to earn some rewards for truth telling. And then you're going to use job grounding or timeout, depending on their age, for opportunities where you've known they lied. And you don't have to have 100% of the evidence to demonstrate that. If you even have the perception that they have, you're going to deliver that consequence. So I hope that makes sense, but that's a general approach.
Okay. That sounds great. I know this won't surprise you, but there are many questions about rewards, specifically screen time, television, video games, money. Are those are rewards that people are uncomfortable with, and yet there are ones that their children seem to respond to. What are your comments on screen time and as rewards in the reward? Yeah, area?
It's tricky. So, first thing I'll say is that in general, screen time is not, it's not something that anyone loves to do for their child. We know that it's probably not going to make them smarter or a better person necessarily. So I understand, I think, to some degree where that comes from. And yet at the same time, if that's one of the things that most strongly motivates your kid, and we have got to teach them some skills that will last a lifetime, that may be one of the best ways to get the process started. And so, I would never say that the amount of it needs to be unlimited. It can be within American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines about, how much screen time people should get, which, by the way, I think they have a family media planner on their website, which is lovely.
Oh,
I love it. And it includes kind of contracts around that. And so that might be another great resource for people to check out.
The American Academy of Pediatrics website. Great.
Yeah. And so I think it's called their family media planner.
Okay.
But kind of backing up to that question, food rewards, screen time rewards, none of those are things that people love doing, or money even. But if they motivate our kids, I would encourage you to think about it. One is not bribery, because that's definitely something I hear. Why do I have to bribe my kid? Or why do I have to reward them for something they should just be doing? The answer is yes, they should, but they're not. They're delayed in their development in part because of their ADHD. And so to help them get there, we have to motivate them by something that matters. And so you may start out that way, but gradually over time replace it with other more meaningful social rewards. Okay.
What about kids who, there are 4 or 5 examples here, just full on meltdown, just really angry, hit back, just out of control. One parent says she tries to wait until that passes before talking to him, but she's not really sure how to best proceed with a kid who really has a serious meltdown. explosive behavior.
Those meltdowns are the worst. They feel like a million minutes have gone by when in reality it's only 2. And I think it can especially feel that way when those things happen out in public or in a situation where things feel unsafe. So let me tell you that regardless of whatever behavioral parent training program you get involved in, the work about avoiding temper tantrums or those severe meltdowns is all going to be focused on helping change the trajectory, the path that kids are headed on before they're in meltdown mode.
Right.
Okay, so it's going to be all about helping you recognize what those sort of pre-triggers are and what their signs are that they're starting to get escalated, and then figuring out ways to not remove expectations, but maybe change it a little bit so that we can chart a new course. Once we're in severe meltdown mode, there is not a single magical thing that you can do to turn it around. There's nothing. These are sort of, you can think of them like as explosions and followed by some fire. Like there's no fire extinguisher necessarily, except that you do want to try to limit your attention as much as possible during that, because it can serve to provide some additional fuel for the meltdown that would have ended on its own otherwise. And you can do things to help maintain the safety of the environment for you and your child without talking much to them. Once they're in meltdown mode, that's kind of the best that you can do. And so that might mean bobbing and weaving with your own body so that you're not in the line of fire, so to speak. It might mean picking siblings up and taking them to another room. But it shouldn't be a lot of one-on-one coaching your child through their emotions and the wording to express how they're feeling. When they're that escalated, there is no win. It's just waiting.
Just wait till it's done. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I will also say that in my work with parents, I do a lot of development of coping strategies for parents. So cognitive behavioral techniques on ourselves as adults, things that we can use to help us maintain some comfort in those moments that are so stressful, deep breathing, kind of all of those things. And so good behavioral parent training will cover that too.
Right. Absolutely. Because the parents need help. Several people have asked how to proceed when their spouse is not on board. So, what's the best course of action when you're the one who's trying to use these techniques and your partner, your spouse is just not on the same page?
Gosh, well, my heart goes out to you when that happens, because there's nothing more frustrating than feeling like you're putting in the work, but that maybe in some ways you're not seeing the full benefit of it because kids are getting different approaches based on which parent is interacting with them. So, I guess I would say part of what maybe needs to happen is potentially helping the parent understand what the deficits are with ADHD and why these things are helpful. So, I think a lot of people have these very, kind of old school ideas about what ADHD is and what it's not, and that these things are all fluffy, duffy, hippy dippy stuff. The reality is there's a long science base to it, and there's a long history of understanding the real brain differences that happen in these kids. And so if it's a difference of understanding about the science, I think that's step number one. And getting them to come to one office visit with you, where hopefully the person they're working with can help explain that, might be step number one. Step number two is, I think, just owning it and doing your best, recognizing that the result you're going to get from the behavioral parent training is going to be less. It's not going to be as good as everyone was using it consistently. But having one parent deliver consequences and praise in the way that we know is the best fit for kids is better than having no parents do it at all.
Yeah, that makes sense. Last question. Unfortunately, we're out of time. There's so much we could talk about here. How does parent training, behavior training work in a school setting? And how does it translate to school?
Yeah, I love this question. And it's something that, scientists are starting to get a lot better at these days. So integrating what we know into the schools sometimes takes a number of years. So we might know that a certain treatment is effective 10 or 20 years before in practice it actually starts to get used in schools. And there are whole fields of people and clinics that are now working on the dissemination of this information. So long story short, The daily report card for kids with ADHD is an incredibly evidence-based intervention. It's a behavioral intervention. In fact, it was on one of those slides that I showed you. There are ways of doing that just for classroom behavior that dramatically improve the rates at which kids complete their seat work and their homework and having their materials and being on time and all the things that can be problematic in the school setting. And so that daily report card intervention is priority number one for a lot of these kids.
Yeah, and I want to say that you can find daily report card samples all over the place, but we do have some on the Attitude website. So if you use the search engine, you'll find some printable daily report card set for different ages, and they really are very helpful for translating school to home. So, Dr. Allan, thank you so much. The work you're doing is amazing, and we're really grateful for your time today. It was a wonderful presentation, just really clear, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Listeners, next Tuesday we have Ann Dolan, who, if any of you have heard her, is also super presenter on the very popular homework topic, getting homework done on time and without drama, next Tuesday at 1 p.m. And then the week after, we have Chris Dendy, which specifically what teachers need to know about students with ADHD in the classroom. So don't forget to come back. And if you are looking for a certificate of attendance, just stay on. You'll see, and when that webinar ends, you'll see a pop-up and a screen with some questions. Answer those, and you'll receive your certificate by email. So thanks, everybody, and have a great week.
For more Attitude Podcast and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.